Good evening, viewers. Welcome back to my channel Literati. Uh, Today, I will discuss, or rather, I will have a conversation with you on a topic which is related to literature. At the same time, it is not related to literature directly because what has happened recently has triggered a chain of thoughts which bring me back to some ideas or some thoughts which occurred to me, and of course they are related to English literature, but at the same time they are also a mixture of history as well as the present scenario, as well as some ironical observations on life in general, because the event which I'm going to talk about, it emphasizes the fact that life brings us back to a full circle, and often there are events which happen and which could never have been predicted some years back, or rather, history takes us in a direction which is never expected. That is why we uh, feel, or there is a certain fact about history that we can never master it. We can be slaves to it, but we can never master it. And it is impossible to predict the turn of events because they are unexpected, they are momentous, and in fact, history is written and rewritten many times over. Well, this particular today, this conversation, I'd like to call it a conversation because it is more sharing of my viewpoints, my perspectives, not only on literature but other things which come along with literature, because literature and life are inseparable. So, generally, I don't like to give a very scholarly talk or just base it on uh, intellectual exchange or in a kind of lecture which confines itself to the topic which I take up. I like to wander off and meander in different directions so that I sort of build up an understanding of all the various complicated strands of life, of events, of things which happen, of the past, the present, and the future. Today, in particular, what, like I said, what triggered off this chain of thoughts in me was the fact, which is that Rishi Sunak, the man with a brown skin, the man with an Indian origin, is the Prime Minister designate of United Kingdom, and he has won the race to become the next man who will be living in 10 Downing Street. He is the future Prime Minister of England. So I think this proves, like nothing else, that the empire has now, or the empire strikes back at the heart of the erstwhile colonizers, of the erstwhile powers which had colonized the Indian subcontinent and made it a part of the British Empire. So now history has projected the colonized people to a position where they have a direct say in the policies of the country which had colonized them in the past. It is certainly momentous the irony cannot be lost. Particularly, to my mind, came the infamous Minutes of Education by Lord Macaulay, which he delivered on the 2nd February 1835. An imperialist to the core, he had advocated the spread of English education to brainwash the Indians. He had not exactly used these words, but the idea was quite clear. He had said that we need to create a race of people who are only brown in their skin color, but completely European in their thought, their concepts, the idea, their faith, even, because he's advocated or he emphasized on the fact that the entire efforts of the government should be in that direction to gradually erase out the vernacular languages, the schools which taught Arabian, Persian, and Sanskrit literature, except the Hindu college in, or the Hindu uh, organizations in Banaras, and the madrasa which taught Persian in Delhi, and the the other educational systems which taught in the ancient Indian way should be replaced, or they should now gradually the funds should be withdrawn from them so that English education can be propagated on a very large scale. This was the idea that with the winning of the minds of the people, the sun would never set on the British Empire, because they did not think, the imperialists did not have this belief or this concept, the possibility did not enter the minds that the British would not rule India. They thought that this was for all time to come, because history has proven it that wherever the European man has put his foot down, the native indigenous people, the native cultures, the ethnicity of that country, that race, that civilization has been lost. We can take the examples of North America, New Zealand, Australia, where the white man has completely erased the native culture and superimposed the Western system of thought, belief, religion, civilization in those countries. In India, that did not happen because of the very ancient and the very evolved civilization and the inherited legacy of an ancient wisdom in the form of religion and philosophy and literature, of course. But these ideas simply did not exist in the mind of Lord Macaulay, and he, in his famous or rather infamous Minutes of Education, which in the modern context invite a lot of ridicule as well as hilarity, because the ideas are so outrageous that they exhibit the limitations of an imperial mindset for whom the possibility that he might be wrong does not exist. Now, the other ideas present in that famous or infamous minute were that the iron rods should be used to break the earthen vessels of Hinduism. So Lord Macaulay was contemptuous about everything Indian. He had also famously said that the entire literature or philosophy of the Orient would not fill up one single bookshelf of an European library. So it is futile to even discuss such beliefs which existed very strongly in the minds of these men, though that very hard stance had come in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, in the 18th century and before that, when the East India officials had come to India, many of these Britishers had become Indiophiles. They had been so impressed by the vast and the ancient soul which was visible in its culture, its civilization, its literature, its religion, that they had adapted themselves to the Indian way of thinking, Indian way of dressing. They had learned, some of them had learned Persian and Sanskrit in order to read the ancient Indian texts and to acquaint themselves with the beauty and the grandeur of these uh, beautiful pieces of literature. But Lord Macaulay and other imperialists like him, there was nothing in the belief system of the Indian people or the value system of the Indian people which was worthwhile. It was to be rejected outright. It was worthless. So, with his strong emphasis on the spread of the English education in India, came the first three universities in 1857, those of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. And the spread of the English education transformed India, the Indian mindset, the Indian intellectual climate, and of course the beginnings, which are the ideas which had percolated, were already being absorbed by the Indian mind. They were creating very potent uh, motives and very strong influences which were visible in the reforms which took over, where the emancipated men like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and other social reformers found all that was lacking in the Indian society, or the complete deterioration which had set in. This can be compared to the age of Renaissance in the 16th century England. But in India, this happened in the 19th century, where there was an overhauling of the age old darkness which had set in, and which had uh, stopped, or which had stagnated the growth, the intellectual growth or the moral growth, as well as uh, the growth of the cultural ethos. That ancient Indian wisdom and heritage and legacy was a thing of the ancient past. But the medieval age India had, or it was a country which was fragmented. There was no center of power. After the disintegration of the Mughal Empire, this became even more, yeah, apparent. And when the East India Company came gradually over the period of time, taking advantage of the uh, lack of unity and the lack of uh, affinity among the different Indian people, or belonging to the different kingdoms of the state, they had over the centuries become the de facto, the unofficial rulers of India, and they had started uh, deciding the policies of governance. So this education, these acts of education delivered by Lord Macaulay, these minutes of education, formulating the way in which the English education should be spread among the Indian people, among the natives as they were known, and which was aimed at completely brainwashing them, annihilating the native soul, we can say. It had a completely different impact, because we all know that knowledge is a key to liberating the mind. And with this new knowledge came a new kind of freedom of thought, and which finally resulted in the freedom struggle. Because for the first time, the Indian intelligentsia, they found a common language, which is the English language. They also uh, were exposed to the new ideas which had come in with this Western education. The new ideas, the new subjects, the new way of thinking, and of course the new literature. And we know that the impact of English literature on the Indian mind created poetry first, because Indian mind was used with the form of poetry, and particularly the epics which had existed in the form of the ancient manuscripts, the great epics of Ramayana, Mahabharata, the great poetic dramas like Meghdut and Kalidas, and it was a form which was familiar to them. By this time, in the England or in the English literature, novel had already become a famous form of literary expression, but the Indian mind took time to adapt itself to the form of the novel. And so the novel, the Indian English novel, really begins only in the second decade of the 20th century. There were some beginnings like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Rajmohan's Wife in 1864, which was serialized, but it uh, was serialized in a short-lived journal, and now it's become more or less obscure, important only because of the historical fact. And then Toru Dutt's Bianca. But the major achievement in the realm of Indian English literature in the 19th century was in poetry. Toru Dutt, Henry de Rousseau, Sri Aurobindo, and at the close of the century, other great poets, and with the advent of the 20th century, Sarojini Naidu. But poetry was already well established by the time we come to the 1920s, and the first generation of the Indian English writers, R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao, and Mulk Anand, come on the scene. And there were some historical novels also in the first decade of the uh, 20th century, and they were like Amrapali and so on. But they were just historical romances, and the historical sense, which is the term which has been used to define the realism which should exist um, in the form of the fiction, came only when the Indian mind became aware of its own uh, present society and express it in their words. But now, what I was going back to, or what I want to go back to, is the fact that a man of Indian origin is going to be the next Prime Minister of United Kingdom. He is the uh, designated Prime Minister, and to view it in the context of what Lord Macaulay's famous Minutes of Education proclaims in 1835, because from 1835 to 2022, it is not even 200 years. We are still short, a few years short of 200 years, and in 2 centuries, the world has changed, or it has completely created a scenario, or it has created a situation which would make people like Lord Macaulay turn in their graves. And Lord Macaulay is, of course, almost 2 centuries back, and a lot of water has flown under the bridge since then, if we can say. But if we take it in the larger context of the entire flow of history, then it is not too long, but still closer to the present. We can take the example of Winston Churchill, and when India won independence, he was also a die-hard imperialist. He was not very confident of the fact that the Indians would be able to govern themselves. He, all like other white people, the white supremacists, thought that it was for the good of these people, the natives, the colored people, that the white men should look after them, supervise them. It was, after all, the white man's burden. And then it creates such a feeling of bemusement, and at the same time, it is so ironical that now, though critics say that Rishi Sunak is only a man of Indian origin, but that is, of course, nitpicking. He is Indian by his genes or in his origins, and apart from being an Indian, a staunch Hindu, because he was the first man to, a member of parliament in the British Parliament, to take oath on Bhagavad Gita. And again, view it in the light of what Lord Macaulay had said about Hinduism, to take the iron rods of Christianity and to break the earthen vessels of Hinduism. With this kind of uh, lack of generosity of spirit, or a completely closed mind. In fact, their minds were closed with their own fixed ideas. And to see someone who is an Indian by origin, who's a deeply religious Hindu, now taking over the 10 Downing Street and assuming the office of the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, it's certainly once more a statement of the fact that history is unpredictable and we should never assume anything or we should never be too sure about anything because events play out in such a manner that we can only marvel at them. Some events which have never been foreseen, never thought would ever happen, and those who are lucky enough to witness such events as the present moment can only understand the significance of the moment and also, like I said, the irony of the situation when you compare it to what Lord Macaulay has said and the attitudes of the British colonial powers, the British statesmen, all of them who were imperialists, and we can only understand that history has many lessons to teach us. Now, this is about Rishi Sunak and his uh, coming prime ministership. But then I also thought about taking a look at all of us who have been fed on English literature. Of course, English is a language which came in with the British and it has given us an advantage, no doubt. Uh, English is a world language, and all Indians, thanks to their colonial legacy, though we are trying to disown it, this is also one of the fortunate aspects of this encounter, this linguistic encounter between the Indians and the English, that all the Indians are bilingual. And we who have studied English literature, who have a natural affinity to it, I almost feel that it is, as Kamla Dasa said, it is the language of our soul, of our heart, the English literature which has seeped in our consciousness, it has percolated in our minds, it has shaped our intellect, it is something which appeals to our taste. Those who are die-hard literary people, and apart from that, to be very pedantic, it is also the bread and butter which we have been lucky enough to use it to win our bread and butter. So that is also a fact. But then another peculiarity or another irony is that studying English literature, though English was certainly an alien tongue, now it doesn't feel alien, but English literature is, of course, a literature which belongs to England. The 20th and 21st century, it has become a world literature. You have Caribbean literature, Australian literature, African literature, Canadian literature, and the literature of all those countries which were Commonwealth countries, which were a part of the colonies, and now they come under the term Commonwealth countries, New Zealand, Australia, of course, India, Indian English writing. It has created a powerful class of literature in English writing. That is undeniable. And we, as people, Indians with brown skins, but uh, a taste which wears or which is totally focused on English literature, uh, the literature which came in from England. We have studied literature in great detail. We have seen the development of English literature. We have seen the various influences. We know about the different invasions in which shaped English literature. We know about how the Romans came in 53-54 AD uh, and 42 AD. We know how the Roman alphabet and the Roman numbers came in with the Romans. We know about the Anglo-Saxon periods. We know about the literature which was created from the 5th century onwards, the invasions by the Danish, by the Vikings, by the Germanic tribes, by the mighty Scandinavians, by the French, by and of they're mixing with the original English inhabitants, the Celts, the Angles, and creating new motifs, the advent of Christianity, the building of monasteries, the cathedrals, the triumph of Christianity over the Anglo-Saxon hedonism and the spirit of heroism, the replacing of the old Nordic gods of war with Christian figures, with the triumph of Christianity, the replacing of the mythical world of this Anglo-Saxon literature of Beowulf with more recognizable Christian or English landscape in the poems which started of occurring before the 10th century itself, with almost immediately after Christianity spread in England. In the notable name which comes to mind during this period is cardamom. We know all about it. We know how the linguistic influences shaped English language uh, uh, till the 10th or till the first millennium, till the 10th century, when we also know how the in 1066 the Norman conquest was a turning point, and even though the Vikings did come in waves after that in the first uh, 1000 to 1045, there were three or four invasions which halted the spread of Christianity. By the time we come to the second millennium, Christianity has been well established. It was the period of the uh, shaping of the Indian consciousness, English consciousness, the English language, the English religious spirit, the English ethos. All these races, Danes and the Jutes and the Angles and the Normans and the Germanic tribes, they all now fused together in the growth and the development of the English language and the English people. The ancient dialects, the Northumbrian dialects, now gave way to Old English. The two streams of religious and romantic feeling grew. There was a rapid increase in vocabulary, which exhibited itself in the 14th century in the presence of Langland, the great religious poet, in the works of romantic adventures mixed with religious fervor and feeling, like Motte Arthur, Malory's Motte Arthur, the coming of Chaucer, the father of English literature. We all know who the father of English literature is because of his humanity, his romantic spirit, his uh, realism, as well as his secularism, which exhibited the beginning of the next great phase in English literature, that was Renaissance and Reformation. We also know about the translation of Bible by Wycliffe in Middle English. We also know the history of his execution. We know that in the 16th century, Renaissance and Reformation took place, and which completely constituted or transformed the life and the world of the English people as well as the literature. We know about the concepts of the Christian ideals as they were exhibited in the plays of someone like Dr. Faustus, created by Marlowe. We marvel at the loveliness of Shakespearean comedies, his extraordinary characters, his the lovely ladies which he has presented, the tragic grandeur of his tragic figures, the extraordinary beauty of the poems which he has written. We come to the 17th century, we all know about the authorized version of the Bible, which was authorized by James the First, and which he had constituted an entire team under the supervision of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and which has remained the most, um, as the uh, term describes it, the most authorized translation of the Bible, increasing the vocabulary very powerfully, because there are terms like "let there be light," which are present in that beautiful, that extraordinary work, that great literary feat, "My Brother's Keeper," which have become a part of the English lexicon. And then we see this. We know that the 17th century English literature, or the history of English literature, as the uh, the age of Puritanism, Jacobean drama, the end of Shakespearean age, the Cavalier poets, the Puritan age, the history as well as the Commonwealth period, the Puritan rule, the shutting down of theatres, the opening of theatres. We have laughed at the Restoration comedy and seen the stiffness in the heroic tragedies. We come to the 18th century, we see the growth and the change of the prose and satire and the beginning of the novel. We have seen the changes in the novel. We have seen the novel replacing all other forms of literature excepting poetry, particularly and becoming the foremost form of literature. We have read and we have felt the beauty of the romantics. We know about daffodils. We have seen Shelley serenading the west wind. We have marveled at the beauty of the autumn in Ode to the Autumn. We have Ode to Autumn. We have heard the song of the nightingale. We have seen the dejection and depression of Tennyson in Memoriam. We have read the novels. We know the lonely, unloved child and the cruelty of the Victorian age society in Charles Dickens. We know all the growth and the changes. We have known the events which have acted as a catalyst in changing the and shaping the mindset and the temperament of the people in the 20th century. We know about World War One, we know about World War Two, we know about the wasteland which has been described by T.S. Eliot, representing the modern deterioration of the modern day civilization. So we, as people who have grown up on literature, or who rather, this is our uh, intellectual, the intellectual climate or the intellectual ethos which we live in. But what has happened in the development of the Indian context in the medieval ages? We know names of Kabir and Mirabai, and we know about Ramcharitmanas, we know about Rahim's Dohe, we uh, know about all these developments in a very vague, offhand way. We know about the ancient manuscripts, the great epics, Vedas and Upanishads and Mahabharata and Ramayana and the great poetic dramas. And but generally, we have been oblivious to it, the great Indian heritage. And the irony is, so let me say that I would just emphasize on the irony of life itself, that when the English mind turned to the Indian myths and recreated it, translated it, then they were sort of projected in the eyes of the world, and even in the consciousness of the Indians. Only then it filtered in. And then Torudat has used the myths in her poem, the Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan. Sri Aurobindo in the 19th century wrote about Savitri, the legend of Savitri. Michael Madhusudan Dutt wrote about Meghnad Badh, and apart from that, there was various translations in English and sort of uh, making them literature or creating an awareness about them. But as Indians, we have, or we are still reading, we know a lot about Western literature, about English literature. We know it by the back, like the back of our hand. Like we can reel off how the Anglo-Saxon period began, how the Norman period began, what were the medieval English period, what the reasons for medievalism, what were the reasons for the Renaissance, what the Reformation was about, how the Bible was translated by Wycliffe, by Tyndale in the 16th century, and the impact of the authorized version of Bible during the reign of James the First in 1611. But and then of course the trajectory of English literature as it moves from one phase to another down the centuries to the present time. But we have not really been aware of the growth and the development of the Indian literatures, wherever they are regional, or whether they were based on the on Persian and Sanskrit, or Khadi Boli as they were known, uh, in a really coherent manner. And Indian English writing, of course, when it began, even in the 1920s, well, someone said about R.K. Narayan's writing in English that critics said that it was like, quotation, Matthew Arnold in a sari, quotation. So they found this whole idea, this concept of Indians writing in English quite ridiculous. And in the beginning, of course, there were those stumbling blocks, like there were direct translations by Bhavani Bhattacharya and some very potent Hindi swear words which sounded very awkward when translated in English. But apart from that, with those were the, we can say, the limitations. But then with a more urbanized and a more westernized generation of writers taking over and creating themes which are not really confined to the Indian way of life in the rural India, like it was the norm in before 1947, the Indian English writing which was written in before 1947. But after 1947, Indian English writing has become more urbanized, and it has ethos, or it has motifs, or it has a kind of uh, atmosphere in which we can imagine a group of people talking and thinking and speaking in English and interact in English, and in a more urban and a more westernized scenario. But it was a bit awkward in the in the colonial period, when the Indian reality, which was expressed in Indian English writing, was more of the traditional orthodox modes which existed, and of course the freedom struggle which occupied the Indian writers and thinkers. And it was because it was a historical movement which everyone was involved in, and they could not remain untouched from it. So that had a more Indian flavor. But now, when these writers, the Indian English writers, they are talking about the preoccupations or their concerns in their books, they manage to capture an international audience. And as a result, we find that many Indian writers have won international acclaim, and they have won the international prizes. So the empire has created a class of people who were Macaulay's children, maybe, but now they have sort of turned the situation on their head. And so the not only the Indian writers, but an Indian politician is now going to be the Prime Minister of United Kingdom. So I was talking about the present scenario and how Indian English writing has catapulted itself to the world stage. And if we take a look back at the prizes which have been won, it will happen long time back in 2000. The first prize, first Nobel, which was won by Rabindranath Tagore, was in 1913. Then V.S. Naipaul, though again he, like Rishi Sunak, is an Indian by origin, but again he is an example of the impact which colonialism had on the Indian people, because he is a Trinidad born Indian and his roots are in what the British had created, which was the coolie trade, where Indian laborers were uprooted from India and they were taken to the far flung sugar colonies, where they became the first generation, second generation, third generation Indian. So V.S. Naipaul is a Trinidad Indian, and he, a formidable name, a man who has literary standards which have put him in a class of his own. He has won the Booker Prize in 1971 for In a Free State. In 2001, he won the Nobel Prize for Half a Life. And then, if we take a look at the recent past, there is a long list of names who have won the Booker, and they are all familiar names to us. Salman Rushdie in 1993 for Midnight's Children. Again in 2008, the Booker of Bookers. He unanimously voted to win the Booker of Bookers. So it was an added prize, an added recognition. Arundhati Roy, 1997, for God of Small Things. Kirat Desai, incidentally the daughter of Anita Desai, for her An Inheritance of Loss in 2006. Aravinda Adiga in 2008 for The White Tiger, and in 2022 the translation of Red Samadhi, a Hindi novel by Gitanjali Shree, which has won the Booker in translation. So again, the Indian English writing has proved its credentials, just like the Indian man in 10 Downing Street has proven that history can bring us to a place which is momentous, which is extraordinary, which is something which nobody would have ever thought possible, which proves that history can teach us so many lessons, which create a feeling of humility in us to see that we are people who are faced all the time with events which are too complex for us to understand. You know, if you look down at any ancient civilization or the world civilization, if the history, and we see that empires have been built, empires have been lost, things which, or those great despots who had seemed invincible, they have also been erased out by time. Time which is unpredictable, time which is merciless, time which is in a constant flow, and time which always teaches us lessons of life which are so valuable. So, apart from philosophizing, I would just say that we should enjoy this moment. We should marvel at the irony. We should look at what life brings us, or the passage of life, with a sense of detachment, remembering that nothing is impossible. History is our master. We are slaves to it. And nothing and nobody is immune to history. Thank you.